taking the fight to the drug dealers and drug pushers, which frankly I think is the number one way we're going to stop.
At 8:30 in the morning, what was supposed to be a regular Department of Transportation inspection on Interstate 40 flipped into something nobody on that scene was ready for. When federal agents cracked open that trailer, they stopped cold. Tucked behind stacks of legit freight sat 340 kilograms of pure cocaine, and the real shock came when they realized the truck wasn't from some unknown backroad carrier. It was rolling under the name of the third largest trucking company in the entire country. That moment didn't just hit the news. It cracked open one of the wildest criminal cases the FBI has touched in recent American history. As the investigation spread, the truth they uncovered was way darker than anybody expected. Transnational Freight Services, a billion-dollar giant trusted to move America's goods, was basically being steered from the shadows by a cartel network. Out of 400 drivers, 89 were knowingly hauling illegal product across state lines, and 23 warehouses across 14 states were being used as silent drop points. This wasn't random smuggling. It wasn't one rogue employee trying to make side money. This was a long-running, well-built system using legit shipping lanes to move cocaine, methamphetamine, and fentanyl straight into communities from coast to coast. The scale of it, and the way it slipped into an everyday company without raising alarms, shook even experienced federal teams. By the time coordinated raids went down, dozens of drivers were in cuffs and a multi-million-dollar criminal network was torn apart. The fallout stretched way past the arrests. It sparked a bigger, uncomfortable question about how exposed America's heartland supply chains really are. If a major trucking corporation can get infiltrated that deeply without anyone noticing, what else is slipping through the cracks? For years, Transnational Freight Services looked like the type of company nobody would ever second-guess. Their trucks ran non-stop across the country, carrying food, car parts, electronics, and all the regular products that keep everyday life moving. With hundreds of tractors on the highway and contracts from coast to coast, the company was praised in industry reports as a model for modern logistics. No scandals, no rumors, no red flags from regulators or competitors. Just another big name in a busy freight market. That spotless reputation is exactly why the Interstate 40 discovery hit so hard. When investigators traced the seized cocaine back to Transnational Freight Services, they expected a single dirty driver or maybe a small security slip. What they found instead was something far bigger, running far deeper than anyone imagined. The deeper investigators pushed into the case, the more the whole story flipped on its head. According to reporting from the Associated Press and a later statement from the U.S. Department of Justice, the company wasn't just infiltrated. It had been slowly taken over through a maze of shell companies built to hide the real bosses. On paper, everything looked clean. In reality, the line of control pointed straight toward individuals tied to the Sinaloa Cartel, one of the strongest criminal forces on the planet. This wasn't some small-time crew sneaking packages into the back of a trailer. Federal documents showed the takeover played out quietly and patiently through layered payments, hidden ownership stakes, and front office executives who looked legit from the outside. By the time authorities picked up on strange patterns in the company's operations, the structure was already locked in. The cartel didn't need fear tactics, relied on paperwork, contracts, and keeping everybody quiet. The DOJ confirmed that this setup allowed illegal shipments to travel side by side with legal freight without raising alarms, using the company's good name and established roots as a shield. What hit investigators hardest was the scale. Court records released in July 2025 revealed that dozens of drivers were knowingly involved, operating inside a system built on loyalty, secrecy, and steady payouts. Warehouses that moved normal consumer goods during the day transformed into distribution points after dark. Because the company handled so much legit cargo, the suspicious loads blended in like nothing was off. AP News reported that this was exactly why the operation ran for years without anyone catching on, even while massive amounts of product were flowing through major cities and shipping corridors. At this stage, the case wasn't just about narcotics. Federal officials began labeling it a national security issue tied directly to the stability of America's supply chains. A criminal network had managed to flip a major U.S. transportation company into a hidden logistics machine, exploiting the same roads and infrastructure that everyday life depends on. In interviews cited by Reuters, investigators warned that this setup represented a new wave of organized crime, one that borrowed tactics from global corporations instead of old-school smuggling crews. From the government's point of view, the threat was obvious. If one huge carrier could be compromised this deeply, nothing guaranteed others weren't at risk. That realization shifted the mission. It was no longer about rounding up drivers or pulling substances off the road. The focus moved to exposing and tearing down the financial layers and corporate shells that made the entire takeover possible. At that point, the story had grown far beyond the dope itself. What started as a routine investigation turned into a full-on showdown between federal and state authorities and a criminal network that knew exactly how to move in the open without being noticed. The big question hanging over the case was simple but heavy. Was this just a few drivers bending the rules? Or had the entire company been folded into a larger operation working behind the scenes? As the FBI traced the trail back to that first discovery on Interstate 40, they expected to uncover something small, maybe a couple of drivers pulling side deals for fast money. Instead, what began to surface didn't even feel real. Once the Bureau dug into company records and ran interviews, it became obvious this wasn't about a handful of bad apples. This was organized, structured, and way deeper than anyone imagined. Out of roughly 400 drivers working for transnational freight services, 89 were knowingly transporting illegal product across state lines. These weren't random trips or spur-of-the-moment choices. The schedules, the routes, the instructions they followed all pointed toward planning. This wasn't luck and it wasn't chaos. It was coordination. The realization shifted the whole case. When most people think of smuggling, they picture last-minute hiding spots or someone praying they don't get pulled over. Here, nothing about the pattern looked accidental. The consistency alone showed these drivers had become pieces of a bigger structure that merged legal trucking with illegal trafficking in a way that made the two almost indistinguishable. Then the investigation took an even darker turn. The drivers weren't the only ones in play. Across 14 different states, law enforcement found 23 warehouses tied directly to the company's nationwide network. From the outside, they looked normal, just standard distribution centers keeping goods moving. Inside, they served a second purpose. They were being used to mix everyday freight with narcotics before shipments continued across the country. This double-life setup was what made the whole scheme so dangerous. On paperwork, Transnational's logistics looked picture-perfect. Trucks in, trucks out, everything moving on schedule. But in reality, those same routes were being used as a shield. Cocaine and other substances were being moved right alongside legitimate cargo, hiding in plain sight. Because the company handled such large volumes of normal freight, the questionable shipments blended in almost perfectly. Nobody outside federal agents had any reason to think something this large could be moving through the backbone of America's supply chain without a single obvious warning sign. As federal teams dug through digital logs, GPS routes, and freight paperwork, the real shape of the operation slowly came into focus. This wasn't some street corner conspiracy held together with guesswork. What they were looking at ran with the timing and precision of a military-style logistics machine. The drivers weren't freestyling anything. They were running mapped-out routes and strict timelines that lined up perfectly with key distribution hubs, moving controlled substances across state borders and into cities where they would eventually be sold or passed along again. That was the moment everything shifted. Investigators stopped viewing this as a simple narcotics case and started treating it like a national-level threat. It was no longer about catching people after the product surfaced. It became a mission to break down a structure that had turned a major American company into either a clueless carrier or a willing partner for one of the strongest criminal organizations operating today. The deeper the FBI went, the more serious the picture became. This wasn't a situation where a few workers messed up. Nearly a quarter of the company's drivers had stepped into organized crime territory, and dozens of distribution centers had been turned into quiet nighttime hubs for illegal shipments moving under the radar. That level of infiltration forced investigators to rethink everything they assumed about modern smuggling. Most folks believe a trucking company's job is simple: pick up goods and drop them off. But what agents were facing was something far more advanced, a hidden battleground where normal shipping lanes had been converted into lifelines for an illicit network that moved like a shadow across the country. The realization changed the direction of the entire operation. It pushed investigators to expand their scope, dig deeper, and start viewing every route and warehouse as a potential puzzle piece in a nationwide system. If this was a coordinated network and not random smuggling, then the next question became unavoidable. How did all this product move across the United States without anyone on the outside picking up the slightest clue? The substances didn't enter the country with noise or mayhem. There were no wild boat chases, no desert standoffs, no dramatic scenes at the border. As reported by AP News and later backed up in federal court filings, the narcotics came in through El Paso, Texas, sliding quietly into the same commercial lanes used to move ordinary cargo every single day. To customs systems and freight software, nothing looked strange. The shipments fit the profile of everyday loads. They were logged, cleared, scanned, and pushed forward just like thousands of others. Once inside the country, the substances blended into company-run warehouses, where cocaine, methamphetamine, and fentanyl were handled like everyday items sitting beside appliances or packaged goods. Investigators later told Reuters that this quiet approach was the true strength of the setup. Nothing about it screamed danger. Pallets were scanned normally, truck weights matched expectations, and all paperwork lined up. The key was simple. The illegal shipments didn't travel separate from the legal ones. They moved right in the middle of them. The trailers themselves played a major role in the disguise. Federal affidavits filed by the Department of Justice described hidden compartments built deep inside standard commercial trailers. These weren't sloppy add-ons. The compartments were reinforced, sealed, and tucked into spots that inspectors rarely examine unless they already know what they're hunting for. In several examples mentioned by prosecutors, full loads of narcotics passed straight through checkpoints with no issues because the trailers met all required safety and weight standards. From El Paso, the routes spread across the United States like veins. Trucks rolled east and north toward major logistics centers in Atlanta, Chicago, and Philadelphia. These cities weren't picked by chance. Each one sits at the heart of networks filled with highways, rail yards, and dense urban areas ready for fast distribution. Court documents show that once the shipments hit these main hubs, the substances were split into smaller loads and moved into nearby cities, often in the same day. What appeared to be a basic long-haul delivery run was actually the spine of a nationwide distribution chain. By this stage, the FBI had shifted its entire strategy. It wasn't just about catching loads in transit. It became about reading the patterns. A Department of Justice statement from July 2025 revealed that analysts mapped out routes, departure windows, delivery times, and load weights. When trucks followed identical paths at nearly identical times with a level of consistency that didn't make sense, agents knew they were looking at something far more coordinated than random chance. Those repeating movements eventually exposed themselves when the same warehouses kept showing up at crucial crossroads. These spots turned into high-priority targets for investigators. Little by little, a hidden map began to form underneath the normal shipping routes everyone else saw. That was the point where the case stopped being a basic substance operation and shifted into something far bigger. The FBI wasn't chasing chance opportunities or reacting to random smugglers. It was studying a system that planned far ahead, sometimes weeks, sometimes months. Freight schedules lined up almost too neatly. Drivers rotated constantly to avoid raising eyebrows. Shipment volumes were kept right below the levels that usually trigger deeper checks. One federal investigator later explained to the Associated Press that the coordination looked closer to a military-style logistics playbook than anything tied to criminal activity. That comparison wasn't an exaggeration. Just like a supply chain feeding a distant front line, this network relied on consistency, backups, and complete silence. If one route slowed down, another route picked up the slack. If a driver stepped away, another slid in without disrupting the cycle. No single delivery was the priority. The system itself was the engine that mattered. This is why the substances seemed to disappear into the background. They weren't hiding in dark corners. They were hiding in the flow of everyday freight. By the midpoint of the investigation, federal officials understood that stopping random loads wouldn't change anything. The real challenge was dismantling the structure behind all of it. Every little detail became valuable. GPS pings, route logs, timestamps, fuel stops, delivery intervals. Everything was treated like intelligence. The mission shifted from seizing narcotics to exposing how a criminal network had learned to function like a real corporation inside the United States economy. Once that understanding settled in, the FBI knew the next steps had to be calculated and slow. Bringing down a machine this organized would require the same level of precision that built it. But even with all the intel they gathered, a major question remained. How do you shut down a network without tipping off the people who run it? At this stage, rushing in would have been the most dangerous move possible. After realizing how deeply the operation was blended into the trucking world, agents made the call to ease their pace. According to Associated Press reporting and confirmed Department of Justice filings, investigators allowed the network to keep running for years while they watched from a distance. Every shipment that moved, every familiar route that repeated, every payment that cleared added another piece to a huge puzzle they were slowly building. This investigation wasn't powered by flashy raids or sudden takedowns. It was built on patience and quiet moves. Federal prosecutors later explained that acting too early could have blown everything apart before agents understood just how wide the network stretched. So instead of rushing in, the FBI started sending out quiet subpoenas for company files, shipping records, and ownership documents, lining up what was written on paper with what trucks were actually doing out on the road. Analysts sifted through GPS data from trucks that looked totally normal to everyone else. Patterns only started showing up when months of movement were stacked on top of each other. As the intel grew, the Bureau added human eyes to the mix. Undercover operatives slipped into the edges of the logistics world, posing as contractors, drivers, or tech crews. Their job wasn't to stir things up. They were there to watch routines and confirm the patterns the data hinted at. Reuters later reported that wiretaps were approved only after investigators could prove clear connections between certain drivers, warehouse managers, and off-the-books financial activity. Even when those wiretaps went live, everything was monitored with extreme caution. One slip, one rumor, one wrong person hearing the wrong thing could have tipped off the cartel and erased years of undercover work. Over time, investigators built a map that seemed to breathe. They could see which drivers kept landing on the same routes, which warehouses kept popping up with high-risk loads, and where the money drifted after each successful drop. Court records unsealed in mid-2025 showed that payments followed the same loop again and again, passing through shell companies before being pushed back into the logistics operation to keep it running smoothly. That pattern confirmed what agents had suspected since day one. The network wasn't built just to move narcotics. It was built to keep itself alive. A self-feeding system that blended into the trucking world so cleanly that you could drive past it every day without ever knowing what you were looking at. The tension during this phase of the investigation stayed high. Any unrelated arrest somewhere else in the country could scare a driver connected to the case. Any random inspection could reveal the surveillance. Agents had to move carefully, knowing the whole structure could shift or vanish if they pushed too fast. Federal officials later compared the investigation to a long mental chess match, with both sides trying to predict the next move without revealing their own hand. One wrong shift could have pushed key players underground or forced the operation to relocate far beyond federal reach. By early 2025, the FBI realized it had arrived at a turning point. According to a DOJ press release issued once the case became public, agents finally had enough proof to connect drivers, warehouses, money handlers, and cartel leadership as one linked conspiracy. What was left now was strategy. Picking off suspects one at a time would only scatter the network and warn the rest. The only option was to hit everything at once. That choice became the blueprint for what was later called Operation Rolling Thunder. Throughout the spring, federal teams quietly built the framework. Warrants were drafted, arrest units were placed, and warehouse raids were scheduled across state lines, down to the exact minute. Agents were told not to move early under any circumstance. The mission wasn't just to grab narcotics. It was to shut down an entire system before it could shift, adjust, or disappear. By early summer 2025, the trap was locked in. Drivers kept running their usual routes. Warehouses kept processing shipments. Money kept flowing through the same channels. Inside the network, nothing seemed different. But from the outside, every mile, every delivery, every payment was being watched and recorded. The hunt had reached the point where all that was left was the signal. And when that signal came, it wouldn't be one knock on a single door. It would be a coordinated shutdown of a nationwide machine that had convinced itself it could move invisibly through the country. At 5:03 a.m., while most of the nation slept, the switch was pulled. Across 18 states, federal agents began executing simultaneous actions, a move the Department of Justice later confirmed as one of the largest coordinated law enforcement operations ever aimed at a domestic logistics network. There were no loud sirens tearing down highways and no early warnings to the public. Federal teams moved quietly, precisely, and all at once. The takedown unfolded quietly and with a level of coordination that felt more like a military operation than a criminal bust. For years, the FBI had held back from making early moves, knowing that striking too soon would only expose pieces of the network instead of the whole structure. But now every warrant was active, every arrest team was staged, and every warehouse target was already boxed in. Within minutes, 89 truck drivers were taken into custody almost at the same time. Some grabbed at rest stops, others at terminals, and plenty right outside their homes before anyone had the chance to warn the rest of the network. While that played out, federal teams hit 23 warehouses tied to the operation. They cut through layers of normal business activity that had disguised what was really happening inside. According to DOJ briefings later cited by the Associated Press, the plan depended on speed. Any hesitation could have given parts of the network time to scatter or destroy evidence. Inside those warehouses, agents found exactly what they had spent years piecing together. Pallets were cracked open. Hidden compartments and trailers were exposed. Ledgers, phones, laptops, and drives were secured before anyone could wipe them clean. What investigators uncovered was on a scale few were prepared for. Federal prosecutors confirmed the seizure of 18 tons of cocaine, 4 tons of methamphetamine, and around 680 kilograms of fentanyl, along with roughly $67 million in cash. Reuters later noted that the sheer amount placed Operation Rolling Thunder among the most significant substance takedowns in modern U.S. history, not because of a single giant load, but because the entire distribution system was dismantled in one morning. But the arrests were only one part of the mission. As agents dug through documents and servers, the missing pieces of the puzzle locked into place. Shell companies that once looked like normal logistics partners were now tied directly to cartel-funded financial pipelines. Ownership records, bank transfers, and internal communications laid out how the whole thing had been financed and coordinated from behind layers of corporate paperwork. Federal court filings unsealed weeks later made the structure impossible to deny. The records showed exactly who controlled the network and how deeply it had embedded itself inside the legitimate economy. What set Operation Rolling Thunder apart wasn't just the size of the bust. It was the nature of the target. This wasn't aimed at local dealers or border runners. It was aimed at the logistics backbone that let a cartel operate comfortably inside the United States without drawing attention. Federal officials told AP News that removing the drivers, warehouses, and financial operators all at once eliminated the network's ability to react. There was no backup system waiting to take over, no secondary route, and no alternate chain ready to keep the operation moving. The entire structure collapsed at the same moment. The network didn't fall because of one moment or one arrest. It collapsed under the weight of its own design. From the United States perspective, the message was clear. Organized crime had evolved. It had learned to move like a corporation, using the same American infrastructure that keeps the country running to hide a criminal supply chain in plain sight. Operation Rolling Thunder was built to answer that new threat with intelligence, coordination, and timing, not just force. As DOJ officials explained later, the mission went far beyond seizing narcotics. The real goal was to break apart the machinery that allowed those shipments to move safely for years. By the end of the morning, trucks were parked without drivers, warehouses were locked down, and an operation that had been growing for years was suddenly finished. The highways still looked normal. Commerce rolled on like nothing had changed. But underneath that calm surface, a major artery in the cartel's logistics system had been cut. This wasn't just a tactical win. It was a strategic hit designed to show that even the most carefully hidden criminal structures can be exposed when federal agencies choose patience instead of flashy moves and precision instead of speed. When the investigation finally settled, the full scale of what had been taken apart became impossible to ignore. According to court filings and statements released by the Department of Justice, most of the people arrested now face long federal sentences. Several of the figures tied closest to the operation could end up spending the rest of their lives in federal custody. This wasn't a temporary pause. It was the removal of individuals who had turned parts of the American logistics system into a criminal tool. The company at the center of the whole scheme didn't make it out. Transnational freight services collapsed into bankruptcy soon after. Its legitimate assets were sold under court supervision, its brand taken off the highways it once dominated. What seemed like a powerful logistics empire was revealed to be hollow once the hidden structure was removed. Federal prosecutors later described the organization as dismantled beyond repair, with no path to rebuild anything close to what existed before. And the effects didn't end there. As AP News and Reuters reported in the months that followed, long-haul narcotics trafficking through commercial trucking dropped by roughly 41%. At the same time, deep inspections, financial vetting, and regulatory checks surged across the country. Lawmakers jumped into action, pushing tighter rules on large corporate acquisitions to stop criminal groups from buying their way into critical industries without being noticed. From the American perspective, the message was sharp. Modern conflict doesn't always sit at borders or overseas battlefields. Sometimes it hides inside supply chains, inside corporations, and inside the same systems people depend on every day. It doesn't always move through borders or back roads. Sometimes it slips through spreadsheets, warehouses, and supply chains that millions of people rely on without thinking twice. This case showed just how fast control can shift when those systems get twisted into something they were never meant to be. And the question that hangs in the air now is the one nobody really wants to ask. How many other clean-looking operations out there are being used in ways the public hasn't spotted yet? Drop your thoughts in the comments and let us know what you think about this kind of hidden conflict. And if you want more breakdowns that dig into the quiet fronts of modern security and the shadow moves shaping the world, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, share it around, and stay tapped in for the next one.